Thank you all. Well, let's get right to the heart of the matter. Experts believe the vast majority of people find their jobs through networking. And that sounds all well and good, right? Until you think about who's left out. Because a network can be more important than a hard-earned GPA. A network might be more important than an aced interview. So in this scenario, who's losing out? Specifically, what demographics?
I'll start, because this is something very near and dear to LinkedIn, and we talk about it in the context of what we call the network gap, which is the simple truth that it does matter, in many cases, more who you know than what you know when it comes to getting a job. Mm-hmm. And there are certain segments where this is more pronounced, and we're starting to measure this more intentionally because we have a core belief at LinkedIn that two people with equal talent should have an equal shot at opportunity. But it's exciting to have this conversation today because in addition to talking about the skills gap, we think the network gap is equally important. And here's why. There are segments of individuals who are not born into the communities they need to be able to see the professions they may want to be. And let me be clear, everyone really does have a network. It's just whether or not they have the network they need to get the job they want.
Right.
And
right.
so a couple specific audience segments to flag for you is veterans. Veterans returning from their military service. Highly skilled, highly networked, but not in an area to get the job they necessarily want as they transition back to civilian work.
Yeah, and we specifically focus our work on Black, Latinx, and Native American students and professionals, groups of folks who, as Meg, I think, beautifully sort of alluded, they have networks, but oftentimes those networks aren't connecting them to the right opportunities or to the employers that they would like to be connected with. And so we believe that there are ways to sort of address that.
So how do we fix that? I mean, I'm imagining, say, a first-generation college graduate from a marginalized part of town. What advice would you give that person? What can LinkedIn do for that person?
Great question, and we are working on a lot of both programs, products, and what we call people. So programs, we actually, a great shout out to JobWell, because we work closely with JobWell, because the unfortunate truth is that companies like LinkedIn don't currently have access to the extraordinary world-class talent that JobWell has been able to identify. So that's on the program front. On the product front, we are measuring the unintended consequences of our platform. So we actually now have an ability to make sure that we haven't unintentionally made the network gap worse on our platforms. We measure very intentionally to make sure that that's not happening and to build products to address some of these gaps.
Right, because oftentimes you're invited to connect with someone who went to your school or who has a background that's very much like your own. So
yes.
You could be reinforcing the issue that you're trying to address.
Absolutely. And unfortunately, and I'm guessing this may ring true out with the audience, that most of us, our networks are very homogenous. I mean, I had my own personal experience last year where I started keeping track of the informational interviews I was doing. And I was appalled to learn that literally I was doing informational interviews with people who looked exactly like me, simply by responding to the inbounds. So we have to be intentional about how we show up and make sure that we're reaching outside our traditional networks.
What advice do you give someone who doesn't have a stellar network about how to navigate the hiring process when so much of it happens outside of formal channels?
Sure. I think two main things. One is that luckily there are digital platforms now that are trying to address this challenge. For example, the work that Meg referenced that LinkedIn's doing, certainly JobWell and the work that we would do. But I think the main single piece of advice I'd give is to not view networking as this very transactional, one-directional moment of trying to extract some form of value from another individual where you will be beneficial. I think similar to navigating sort of sponsorship and mentorship in the workplace, it is significantly more effective if you imagine what might I be able to bring and what sort of exchange might we be able to have on an ongoing basis. I think one, makes it less of sort of an intimidating and scary proposition, but two, allows somebody to understand that you do have a unique perspective and experiences and background that are valuable.
And can I actually echo a story about this bidirectional value, because I think it's so important, because I think when people think about closing the network gap, I think they oftentimes default to this one-way direction. When I first realized I was having informational interviews with people just like me, I made a personal commitment to what I call the +1. That I was not going to do another informational interview with someone who looked like me until I reached out and was intentional about doing it with someone who came from a different background. And I announced at a conference, and this woman walked up to me, her name was Brittany. She said, "I'd love to be your first +1." And I said, "Fantastic." And she and I had a great conversation the following week. A couple months later, I got an email from the Obama Foundation with a bunch of job listings, one of which I thought was perfect for Brittany. So I forwarded her and I said, "Hey, Brittany, let me know. I think you'd be perfect for this job. If you're interested, I'd love to refer you." She said she was. I did, and she got the job.
Oh, that's
and let me be clear,
story.
it is a great story, but Brittany's exceptional, and she should have gotten the job, but it's pretty clear to me that without my connection, she never would have either known or maybe not have gotten it without the referral. But now, I have an incredible connection at the Obama Foundation, which has afforded me a great value. So I just wanted to reemphasize that point.
Absolutely.
Mentoring and coaching is also important, and LinkedIn has a special place for that.
We do. We have a program called LinkedIn Coaches, which is our sort of attempt to help close the network gap by intentionally bringing people together, job seekers facing barriers without networks, with either employees or our members, to start having these career conversations. And I mean, one note on the optimistic front, because I know we're looking for optimism. We have an incredible appetite from our members to want to participate and help diversify their own networks, because everyone realizes that we'll all do better with a more diverse network.
I just want to remind the audience that we'll be coming for your questions in a moment, so type them in. Some people just need an understanding about how to create an online brand and how to maximize their voice and a strategy. Is that what JobWell does for people who come to it?
Yeah, I'd say absolutely. I think by building a professional profile, especially for folks who haven't built one before, it is an exciting moment to put out there all of what you've done and what you've built. I think the challenge can be without having some of the same context about what is most relevant to include, you might find yourself at a disadvantage. So we try to use content and other resources to tell folks, here's how to build a resume, here's how to build a strong professional profile. But yeah, that's absolutely how we approach it.
And of course, what we would say, in addition to a strong profile, you have to have connections. Otherwise, you're going to be at quite a disadvantage in getting a job. We actually recently measured, well, actually, we know that 70% of people get jobs based on who you know. Actually, by show of hands, how many of you in the audience have gotten a job based on someone you know at the company?
Wow,
so
that's
about 70, maybe even more, maybe closer to 80 or 90%.
Yeah.
We also know on LinkedIn that if you apply for a job on LinkedIn and you get referred, you are 9 times more likely to get the job versus a non-referred candidate. So this is why, so that's great news for probably everyone in this room, and it's devastating news for an individual who maybe wasn't born into a community that she or he has the connection she needs to get the job she wants. So again, like being super mindful about not just building your profile, but also building your connections. And for people in the room, being mindful about how you show up in the world every day and helping people that maybe weren't born in the same set of connections get access to your network.
Because the workforce of the future, the workers who are coming down the line, it's a much more diverse group than what has been up to this point.
Absolutely. I think that's the economic case and the business case for why having more folks at the table, more folks represented, is really a business and an innovation initiative and challenge, not some siloed HR challenge.
Let's talk about the employer's side for a moment. There's been a lot of talk about inclusive hiring. Is that just talk, or do you actually see changes in the way people are recruiting and hiring for jobs?
I think one piece I'll speak to, when we started our company in 2015 and we first launched, we really imagined that we would have a 2-part sales process. Here is why you should care about diversity, part 1. Part 2, here is why JobWell can be a partner to you in those initiatives. And what's been incredibly encouraging is that has become a 1-part sales conversation. It's the first piece of diversity moving the needle for businesses from a bottom line perspective in terms of the ability of teams to produce good work, in terms of innovation, in terms of financial performance. It's all been shown now. There's a mountain of data. You would be very hard pressed to try to argue against the economic and business impact of diversity. So that's been a positive sort of element of it to continue the optimistic trend. I think the challenges are that folks within organizations really need to care, even at the hiring manager level. If you aren't consciously and very intentionally considering who you're bringing onto your team, it doesn't matter what flag the company is flying or what they're saying in the C-suite or at the leadership level. You really have to make it your work too.
Right. So much of the hiring through connections happens so automatically, naturally. It's almost on a subconscious level. So making people aware of what they're doing is one important step.
Certainly.
Yeah, and referrals remain the #1 source of hires for most companies, and they also remain the #1 source of homogenous hires for most companies. So it is a problem. And as Ryan and I are having a sidebar conversation, I mean, it is a bummer that a company like JobWell has to exist. I'm so glad you guys do, but it is a reflection of some things in our society in our labor markets that aren't working as well as they should.
Absolutely.
That's
And,
right.
and I will say, this isn't a conversation about shame or gotcha moments or pointing a finger at the companies, because I'll be honest about Jopwell. We're like 75% Black and Latin, and we embrace that. But we hired from our own networks as well. We
Right.
brought in folks who were passionate about the work and who were similarly minded, and as a result, we sort of have the flip. And so I think it's just an important sort of recognition that this is something that can be acknowledged. This is not a time where we don't have solutions here, but you have to get really intentional and thoughtful.
Yeah.
All right, let's turn to the audience for a moment. What advice can you give a college graduate?
So a college grad. It's interesting. College, the point of graduation is one of those moments where the network gap is the widest for people who either were born into communities where they have parents who have the networks they need, or if they weren't. So particularly for first-generation college grads, this is a moment of vulnerability for them. So if you're a college grad and you're about to head out to the workforce, definitely leverage your network. If you're a college grad about to head out the network and you have a friend who may not have that same network, my one ask to you is bring that person along with you on your journey.
And I would just say to embrace the non-linear path. I think when you're graduating from college, especially if you don't have a lot of peers, family members, friends who've been there before you're a first-gen college grad, it can be very easy to assume that you're going to just choose this first job and then your career is pretty much decided from there. So I think I would say that it's really critical to embrace the sort of winding path that a career is, and one way that's sort of easy to visualize that is by picking a leader who you admire and really looking at, especially today, most of those folks have had paths that were not obvious from the start, to say the least.
Pivoting being
Absolutely.
the new norm,
Yeah.
Absolutely.
so to speak. Okay, here's another question. When you talk about diversity, are you including age?
That is a great question, and I was reflecting on some of the big nuggets from earlier this morning, and I do think the age is going to be a more prominent and an important component for sure. One thing really quickly, when we talk about diversity and the network gap, we actually talk about it through what we call structural diversity. And this is, if you just bear with me for a minute, this is a concept where if your network has all shared connections, it's not very structurally diverse. If your network has connections to other people, that is a very structurally diverse, which by definition is a healthier, more productive, more valuable network. So for example, when I connected with Ryan yesterday, he and I had 27 shared connections, which it was just a fair amount, but he has a ton of connections. I have 840 shared connections with my CEO, Jeff Weiner. So who's the more valuable connection to me? Is it Ryan or is it Jeff? It is for sure Ryan, because he has all these connections I otherwise wouldn't have access to. So just wanted to quickly flag that as how we think about structural diversity in the context. Now, obviously, Ryan also has, in addition to having other non-shared connections, my guess is he has connections I otherwise wouldn't have had access to that also are more diverse in terms of their experiences, their color, and their gender.
Well, I feel very valuable now.
Okay.
No, I think one thing I would add, diversity is a large umbrella, and I think one way that we think about it, we aren't suggesting that we're defining what diversity is. Diversity is the whole group. Diversity is not, okay, great, we have people of color and veterans and XYZ groups over here. Diversity is the whole group. And so I think diversity is everyone, and once you acknowledge that lens, you have to be very intentional about, as an organization, where are you most challenged? And I think the more intentional and specific you can get about your unique challenges and your areas of underrepresentation, the easier it is to move the needle.
Right. Okay, one more from the question. How do you find the networking spaces you need with the right people if not everyone is helpful? Say you reach out to someone, you think it's going to be a great connection, and the person either doesn't respond or says something that's unhelpful.
Well, I'll start. I guess two things. If someone doesn't respond when you first reach out, for sure reach out again. Do not just go away. Don't stalk them, but definitely give them at least one more chance to respond. But if they're not helpful, move on. Not everyone is enlightened and understands why connecting with you would actually help them as well as them helping you. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think that's super important to keep in mind. There are other folks out there who can sort of help you to progress. So the fact that one individual might not be that person, it's totally fine. That's why LinkedIn exists. There's plenty of other folks out there.
Can you talk a bit about how you found your jobs, the path that you've taken? to get here today.
Well, I mean, I found my job through networking. I worked with Jeff Weiner at Yahoo, so I 100% got my job through a network. There's no question about it. In fact, except for my very first job, I was in the Peace Corps out of college, which I applied for. I didn't network my way into the Peace Corps. But outside of that, every other job I've gotten since then has been through a network.
Really, where were you before Yahoo?
Before Yahoo, I was at an internet startup called NetCentives that sold, believe it or not, frequent flyer miles to get people to buy things online. And I convinced the company that we could sell these frequent flyer miles to get people to donate online. So it worked really well. So anyway, that's how about you?
Yeah. Both my co-founder and I, we found our way to Goldman Sachs, not because of our personal networks or connections. Again, we were both very lucky, and it was a serendipitous situation. We were in the right place at the right time, and were tapped for these very small-scale diversity programs, which I'm sure many of you have heard of. And so once we realized that that was our way in, it wasn't anything else that sort of had set us apart to be tapped. It's one of the reasons we recognized that there had to be a more equitable, more scalable, and efficient solution that companies could leverage to bring in incredible talent that was more reflective of the country that we live in. And so we really left and started Jopwell with the notion that our way of finding these incredible opportunities was just luck, and it doesn't need to be luck. That the opportunity is out there, it's evenly distributed. That the talent is evenly distributed, but the opportunity is not. And so we wanted to sort of bridge that gap. And I think, very similar to a lot of the work that Meg does at LinkedIn.
Well, a lot of times these sorts of things start with icebreakers. We're going to end with them. Question from the audience: what are some of your favorite icebreaker questions when networking? But I'm going to add to that: are there different strategies for online and in person?
Interesting.
Gosh, well, I mean, one general piece of advice when networking using LinkedIn, I mean, LinkedIn is a treasure trove of information. So one thing not to do is, if you are so lucky to get informational time with somebody, do not ask them, hey, tell me about your career, because you can see their career on LinkedIn. And so you can literally customize your questions and show that you've done your homework. And actually, one really clever tip I'll give you is, when you do look up someone's profile, you can actually see what they've been reading and commenting on. So you could even say, hi, student, I saw that you just did this great interview in New Orleans. I loved what you said to so-and-so. I'd love to hear what your perspective is on formerly incarcerated. Mm-hmm. So it shows you've done your homework. It shows you're a thoughtful person. It's just a huge signal of who you might be as an employee.
Yeah, I just want to double click on that. Perhaps not an icebreaker, but just more of a general rule of thumb. The amount of outreach that folks receive saying, hey, would love to grab coffee, or can I pick your brain? Those are, I would suggest that's language that should never be used on
those are cliches
on any
we
of
need
these
to
digital
erase.
platforms. Right,
Okay.
it doesn't show anyone could send that message, but a message that has more thought and includes something that the person might care about. And going back to the point of networking not necessarily being a one-way transaction, what can you present to them? What can you thoughtfully send to them that suggests that you might be able to add value as well? I think that can help.
Ryan, Meg, thank you very much.
Appreciate
your time.
Thank you
Great to be
so
here.
much.